Okay. Yes, thank you, Brother Thad. I really appreciated that section. I really like the word submission. It's interesting because like you mentioned it as like something that goes invisible. It has a greater purpose. As you were talking on that, it just goes on to speak more, and that is like submission, like the underlying mission is there. It's a hidden mission involved in submission, and I think that's very true. That there is something invisible about it. It's something that the world's idea of submission, they don't think that that's anything impressive at all. But when we can show submission, um, we are giving an example of Christ. Um, I do have a question. I kind of wanted to open up the floor to this to just kind of get some answers from y'all. What are things that we submit to, like without our choice? We have to submit to it. So just kind of, I'd like to hear a couple answers from that from people, and then we'll go on to the next question. Raise your hand, or yeah, I see Tom on. Oh.
Taxes.
Taxes. Very good.
I would argue that you always have a choice to submit. You don't have to pay your taxes. You'll just go to jail if you don't.
So you're saying that there's nothing we submit to?
No, I'm saying there's lots that we submit to, but we always have the choice of submitting. Like, you can't be forced into. Like, in the definition, submission is a choice.
Yeah.
So you can choose to obey the law, or you can choose to not obey the law and suffer the consequence of not obeying the law.
Okay, I can definitely appreciate that. I was thinking of gravity and how, like, oh, we definitely have to obey gravity, but I could choose, like, I'm going to pretend I'm going to fly, but gravity still exists and I fall to my death. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, that Victoria is making. I think maybe one of the defining qualities of submission is like the choice to yield. And yeah, there are some things that we, yeah, I mean, like even like let's say I get like a really bad disease, and like, or I don't know, there's something bad happens, like it's outside of my control. Even then I can choose kind of like whether to accept it or not, right? To kind of fight against it or to yield in a way. And so I think that kind of our volition, our choice is a defining characteristic of our submission. You can't have involuntary submission. It's built into the definition that it's a voluntary putting yourself under.
So what are things that we find are easy to submit to as opposed to hard things to submit to? And what makes those things hard? I know for me, like the tax example of why that's hard to submit to is because they don't know me. They're just taking my money and they don't know what each of us are going through one way or the other. And like if there's a little bit more like personal relationship here, it'd be a lot more easy just for me to pay my taxes. So that's one thing that I find that when there's a personal value in it, it makes the submission choice easier. Any other thoughts?
I think also that our habits makes it also difficult to submit because we, like, for example, in Serbia, we have a curfew 3 days. We cannot go outside for 3 days. So my habit is to go every day and walk, but I can't. So, but I have to submit, and I do. But I think it's just a habit that I'm used to going out, but I can't go now.
For me, like your example of submitting to taxes, I may not want to, but I'm more likely to submit to paying my taxes because the consequences of not doing that are worse.
Yeah.
So I find it easier to submit things that are going to cost me, but it's hard to submit when I think I have a better idea than whoever's got the idea. When it doesn't make sense to me, then it's harder to submit.
Any other thoughts or questions anybody has? Thad, as you were going through the sermon, it was closer to the end that I saw that this came up in my mind. You asked the question, how am I submitting to Christ? And the question came to me is, it goes to husbands, is how am I submitting to Christ as a leader and to my family? And with that came like, is it a matter of, for me, is it obedience then? Is submission and obedience the same thing? What do you all think about that?
The reference I started with in Hebrews indicated that Jesus learned obedience through submission. So it sounds like there's a difference, but I think they're very, very much tied together.
Can you be obedient?
I think that they're tied but different, because I think that you can obey without being submissive. I think that being submissive is like includes obedience, but it comes down to your attitude of kind of like Thad was saying, like relinquishing your rights essentially. So you can obey without like doing that, you know.
Can you submit without obeying? Yes.
Yeah,
I think you can submit without obeying. Like if somebody's giving you a direct, like, I need you to do this way, but you think you have a better way of doing something. So like, oh, they're not watching. I'm going to do it my way. They're just going to see the end result. They don't know I didn't do it their way, but it's done. Like I can think of multiple times where like when I used to work at Best Buy, where like, hey, I need you to do this. It's like, not like that. I'll do it the right way. And they just didn't know the difference. Like, again, that sounds really bad, but that's just how it was sometimes.
I would probably say that to me, that doesn't seem like a consummate, complete type of submission. I mean, it got the job done, and the superior probably like was happy with your work. Like I think it is possible to obey without submitting, and I think it's possible to submit without obeying. They are different from each other. You can submit without obeying. I think of the example of the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John in the early chapters of Acts, when they were brought before the Sanhedrin, and they said, you need to stop preaching this Jesus guy and all this stuff about Jesus. And they said, it is better to obey God than man. But they still submitted to the consequences. They were still honoring to the authorities. They were still respectful, but they still submitted. They still had, I think, a heart and a posture of submission. Yeah. Yeah, and so maybe like obedience is a very specific and more narrow expression of submission, but you can express that submission in kind of with an unsubmissive heart, and you can be submissive, and sometimes it doesn't require obedience because there's a higher authority or something else.
I think the example of Peter before the crucifixion when he took up the sword. That was his display of submission there, is to fight back. Whereas you mentioned Judah afterwards, he was not going to obey the commandment to stop preaching, but he was willing to submit to the authorities. And you see that there is no display, even with outwardly or inwardly, that attitude of I'm fighting back with my own strength or means. I will obey God, but I'll submit to your consequences.
It's all really good. Another thing that I came up with a question, kind of, how did you get the three that I think it was three that you listed underneath the giving up the right? Submission gives up the right to be heard, to lead, and to do it your way. Where did you come up with that list?
I don't know. It just came to me. There are probably more. There are probably more that you have to offer.
Oh, I didn't write any more down. I was going to ask the question to others. What are other ways that you've been called to submit outside of these ones that were listed, of being heard, to lead, and to do it your own way?
I have a question about one of those things, like the right to be heard as far as submission goes. Like, how does that practically apply itself? So, like, if we're submitting ourselves to the government and we're giving up the right to be heard, like, do we not vote? Do we not seek trial? Or, if, Victoria is submitting to me, is she giving up the right to question things? Like, where does that fall in? Like, do we still have the ability but not the right? I'm kind of wrestling with that right to be heard one a little bit.
I'm not sure I have a clear answer, because I understand what you're saying. Yeah. So, like, with a husband and wife relationship, I need my wife's input. I need her perspective desperately, but I don't always acknowledge that. I'm a better man if I do listen to my wife. But the right, I don't know.
Like,
Maybe
I
others
guess,
can help me.
like, so would that mean that I can't give my opinion unless Peter, like, asks for it? Like, because I feel like I would, if he, like, is wanting to do something I don't agree with, like, I'm not going to necessarily wait until he asks me what I think. I'm going to say, hey, I don't agree with this. Maybe at the end of the day, he doesn't agree with me. And so then submitting would be to, like, go along with it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean I'm not going to express, like, what I think.
I think there's definitely times that it may be situational as well. I think of that very, like, in normal circumstances, those situations are always appropriate and correct, are almost always appropriate and correct. But I think of, in a sense, and I don't think that this is how a family is supposed to function necessarily, but I think that there are times where someone needs to go do something without the person taking the time to understand it or to be heard, because it needs to get done in, like, emergency situations. Like, if it was always a matter of all the people working together being heard, then the people would probably die because the person in authority wasn't being submitted to. And so in that sense, those people who are surrounded by the leader of, whether it's a paramedic team or a surgical team, if they're not submitting to the authority, they can give a quick kind of questioning it a little bit if it seems like the leader's forgotten something. It's just like, I can see how that scenario changes it a little bit. Now, I don't know if that's going outside of what the scripture is talking about here, but that's just a thought that came to me as we were talking about this, that I think it can be situational to some regards. And I think it's good for each person involved in the discussion to understand where each person thinks the situation, what each person thinks the situation is in. Because some person maybe casual about it and it's not that important, the other person may find it very important. That's, I don't know. What do you all think of that?
Well, partly answering that and partly addressing Victoria's question is, I think it's a hard issue, a hard attitude. Dang it, I have the right to speak my mind. That's one attitude. But then the other is, honey, I think we need to look at this a different way. That's a different hard attitude. And I think that matters a big deal, or a great deal in this whole picture. So Peter, I don't know if that answers the question very clearly, but maybe others can still chime in and help out. I don't know, clarify.
Yeah, I would agree with Peter's question. I think that is a good question. It does, and I think it's good that we're discussing this. And that's some good kind of responses. I think the key in my mind, it hinges on the word rights, and like, what does it mean to have a right? As Christians, like, it is true that the way that we view our rights, I mean, like, submission does have a very close connection with this concept of rights and what are our rights. And I think that's a huge topic in general. But yeah, I would say that it is good to use, especially as people who are supposed to be delivering the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to always be sure that that message is being heard. And we never have the right to relinquish that message when the Spirit is pressing it upon us to speak it. And in that case, it's not my authority by which I'm speaking, but it's the authority of the one who sends me, right? It's the authority of Jesus. I think that would be an example that might maybe help clarify something. I don't know. I would also say that I think that Christians are called out of a rights mentality, because rights kind of tends to center our minds on what belongs to me, and I'm going to retain this that belongs to me, or I'm going to take it back. And whereas like Jesus wants to invert that mindset to where it's not what belongs to me and me holding on to things as much as it is me giving. Like God changes our minds and our hearts from an economy of taking to an economy of giving.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
Thought that also comes as to what degree do we fight for our rights, and kind of going along with the beginning of the idea of submit, like the hidden mission in submitting, that reality of us doing these things because we know that we are accountable to God, the ultimate authority, and that He is the one who's going to defend us. He is the one who's going to speak for us, and in the end is going to make it all right for us. And so when I can keep that mentality in my mind, that He is the one in the end I'm answering to and who I'm daily answering to in reality, I don't have to act like the world and fight for my right to be heard or to lead something or to do something my way. But I need to take all that in perspective and follow the Spirit's leading as I make choices from day to day. And submit to Christ as the ultimate, whether it's submitting to Christ when I should hear my wife out in a conversation, when I should be obedient to serving my neighbor and helping them, or talking more with someone who's passing by, whatever it may be, that I am submitting to the Spirit's call and just trusting the Lord, not putting all the what ifs in the way of why I don't. Does anybody else have any thoughts or questions for Thad or just the group as we've heard the sermon and the discussion so far.
Kind of a question that I had that kind of relates to Peter's question about giving up the right to be heard is like giving up. You mentioned giving up the right to lead, and I think that's good. Like it's true. At the same time, like Jesus kind of defines this paradox of a leader who is also submissive. And so those two aren't like exactly opposite or kind of exclusive of each other. That Jesus kind of marries the two together. And so, especially like my mind started going to like, let's say the leadership of the church. Like we know that Jesus said, none of you are to be called, masters or whatever, or teachers. But at the same time, like there's the gift of leadership that the Holy Spirit gives that's supposed to be exercised within the church. And so, like, what does it mean if it's true, or maybe there's a better way of wording it, I don't know, but if it's true that to be submissive is to give up the right to lead, and maybe it hinges on this word right, but does that mean that we have a leaderless church? Yeah.
That wasn't my intention to communicate anything like that. No, it's when we put ourselves under authority, like in the military application again. If I put myself in the military and say I'm coming under your leadership, that doesn't mean I want you to lead me. No, it's I'm giving up the right for to pursue my own leadership and to submit to yours. Then, so in a church, no, there are responsibilities entrusted to us. I think that's appropriate, and so I think. But again, as you pointed out, the selfish rights being exercised is dangerous, unhealthy even. Yeah.
I think one of and that's a good question to ponder on. But I think if we look at Jesus, who should be our ultimate focus in everything, in which was communicated, is Jesus was always looking to what was before him, and that was the Father's will, the Father's way, and the ultimate glory. And so I think that perspective is good in all of these questions. But the idea of giving up certain things, I think it always has to have that lens of what does the Father say? What does the Father communicate? What does the Father desire? Because if you think about it, if the law came down and said, you cannot do something, and it happened to many of our forefathers, they were told that if they tried to escape and flee the country, that was forbidden. But they did. A lot of us wouldn't be here unless, they were willing to look to a higher authority than the one that was in position of the government or that particular leader. But in all of it, they understood the consequences, but they knew that this was the right choice for the glory of God.
I'm thinking about Jesus who was submitted to the Pilate when he was at the cross. He didn't say anything to him when he asked him, "Who are you?" And then I'm thinking about Jesus when he was speaking with Pharisees and when he was very directly judging them. So I see how Jesus was having different attitudes and towards different people, but also he had different things to say to different people. And I think it all came by because of his close relationship with Father. So I think that for us to be submitted to someone or to any kind of authority, I think we need to have this close relationship with God, and we need to pray, and we need to have the, I think, the spirit of discernment and wisdom, like to discern the situation and the people who we need to be or who we are supposed to be submitted. I think we need that to have discernment, but also to have a wisdom how to react, because Jesus was reacting in different ways to different people. So, but the most important is that we never forget who we are in front of God, and what is our identity, because otherwise we will be hurt, we will be disappointed, people will judge us, maybe without reason, and but then maybe we will still have to be submitted to them. But when we know what is our true identity as daughters and sons of God, and that we're accepted by Father, I think that God will give us strength to how to submit to different people.
Well, thank you, Anna Maria. That's definitely true. I was thinking of just that verse that alluded to in Proverbs about the virtuous woman. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. That reality of just the correct presence before God, that mindset, keeping that correct is so key in everything that we do. Like getting back to our hearts and why we're submitting, why we're okay with not demanding our rights. Is it for the wrong reason, or why we want to be heard? Is our heart right in any of these choices, in any of these different decisions that we have? I really appreciated what you said. Like there is Thad earlier in the sermon, there is no human that is worthy or deserving of submission. I think of just the amazing thing that God still calls us to act that out. The thing that I guess, since obedience, and we talked about that, I was just thinking about children to parents. It says, children obey your parents in the Lord. It doesn't say children submit. So I think there's another example of where we're called to obey, even though our heart may not be right in submitting. It's called to obedience there. You have a question?
It's different from what you were
That's fine.
saying. Okay. So something that really stood out to me in this reading of 1 Peter. So I have a couple of different translations here because I first read it in the NLT. It's chapter 3, verse 5. And it said, "This is how the holy women of old made themselves beautiful. They trusted God and accepted the authority of their husbands." And in different versions, it says and it was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. And I appreciate that the hope and the trust is in God. In that accepting of authority, you're not trusting and hoping in your husband. You're trusting and hoping in God. And I think sometimes I can misplace that. I think some women can kind of misplace that that trust and hope. And I think it's important that we remember that is in God. And in doing that, you can do, and one of the ways you can trust in the Lord is by accepting the authority of a human.
If you place all your trust there, it can get very disappointing, can't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I think that's we'll wrap up the the Bible class section. Caleb, if you have kind of anything closing to say, and then we can transition to our time of open sharing.
I don't have much at all, really. If someone else has something to close it, that's fine. I know that the Lord's definitely working on me in a regard of how I need to submit to Him and follow the Holy Spirit's leading in leading my wife and my children and our family. But even in just the daily things that I choose to do and the example that sets is part of it. I think that's a challenge for each of us, that the way that we submit to the Lord and even the small things is something that speaks to the world. It's hidden, it's not really seen, but it's those small things that still do give evidence and testify and make us who we are from day to day as we submit to Him with every decision and hear His voice through everything that we're doing. And it's amazing when God will speak to us. We can't say like, "Oh Lord, why aren't you speaking to me in every single thing?" I don't think that's the situation that will happen necessarily. It'd be more that we are open and listening and attentive to His voice and purposely making the time to study His Word and to grow to know Him in prayer as well, and just communing with Him. So I pray that, we all can be challenged by that and grow as we submit to our Heavenly Father.
Thank you, Caleb. All right. So now we'll have this